One of the things that I am super excited about on this channel is tackling real world issues. I think that when we get into research and so forth, sometimes we could get into recreational knowledge and things. There's times though where we have real issues that we really need to figure out and really move on and make progress on. And today is one of those days, especially when it comes to the next generation and teens and adolescents and how they form. We're going to have an incredible teacher, someone who's an incredible researcher, share with us today, Matina Montes. She's a native of Chicago. Her and her husband, Mike, and her met when they were in high school, so they're high school sweethearts. And 40 years later, it's amazing, 40 years, they are still thriving very well in God's love. And together, they shepherd with the aim of helping marriages and families in crisis, paying forward God's mercy and grace in their lives. Matina was called back to school 7 years ago in theology. She is pursuing a Master's of Arts in Christian Ministry. Hopefully, all goes well, she will graduate next year, which is really, really cool, at Abilene Christian University, a very respected school, majoring in spiritual formation with a particular passion for children raised in the church. Oh boy, do we need that. And she's going to study what the key attributes are in households and the culture of our congregations that help form resilient disciples. And that's what we're really going to focus on today, is resiliency when it comes to discipleship. Matina, welcome to the channel.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation. Look forward to our talk.
I'm really looking forward to it. Why don't you start out telling us a little bit about your conversion and motivation for ministry?
Sure. Thanks, Kyle. So I think it's important to understand a little bit about my background. I was raised in a religiously conflicted home. My mother was devout Eastern Orthodox. And even though my dad was also raised the same thing, he was agnostic when I was a young person. And so it ended up being very conflicting for me to understand, does God exist? And I started questioning things. I was pretty convinced that, early in my life, I had faith, but then by age 12, I was a professing agnostic. And so I think what God had to do with me in my conversion was to undo some major things. I think that's true for all of us. And I think about the man that Jesus had to heal twice with from blindness. I was, blind religiously, and then I was blind, obviously through my sin. And I did, discover some evangelical, church initially, but I wasn't obedient. And so that also meant I needed a different level of healing. And so this was all in college. I started searching in undergrad, and Mike and I continued to date. And when we got married in the Greek Orthodox Church, I prayed. I knew that we couldn't do this by ourselves. I knew God had to be at the center, but that was all I knew. And so I prayed literally at the Greek Orthodox Church that God would find us a church that we agreed on and would help our marriage. And within 6 months, we were both independently in 2 different cities shared about the ICOC. It wasn't ICOC back then, but the church in Chicago and the church in Minneapolis were the ones that reached out to us. And it's been wonderful ever since. And I think the fact that I was drawn to scriptures about Aquila and Priscilla, that was like the answered prayer. It's like a unified couple doing good and for people and for God. And then all the Priscillas and Aquilas in our lives that, gave to us, paid forward us over the last 40 years. Actually, not 40 years. I've been a disciple 35 years. But just, what they've poured into us, it's time to, pour back. And we have kids that are doing great spiritually, 2 adult kids and a son-in-law and 2 grandchildren that are young. So we just have all these blessings, and it's time to use those blessings in a way to build up the kingdom And so that's why I felt going back to school, even though I work a secular job, was a calling that God had for me.
I remember meeting you, it's got to be 3 years ago. I think it was in Chicago. It was the first teachers conference I had ever been to. And you presented, you remember better than me, but it was on spiritual formation, I believe. We were in this auditorium, like a half circle auditorium, and I remember you, and I was just like, wow. You knew your stuff. And as a therapist, I remember kind of just being in sync, because part of the theme of what you were sharing was sort of therapeutic in nature. And I just remember from that point on, just seeing you at different teachers conferences and so forth, and just a warm person. And I mean that. You really are. You have just an incredible spirit about you. And so that's what I remember. And then we had the teachers conference in San Antonio. Yeah, that was in San Antonio, right? I remember seeing you there. We were in a class together. So anyway, and I saw you at the airport. So, of course, the airport. But no, I've seen you just in the last 3 years of going to conferences and so forth. And it's been incredible.
Thanks for that, Kyle. And just one comment on that class that you mentioned, it was spiritual leadership. And it was the first time that I understood being in a context, I think generational discipleship, like we are in our first or second or third generation, and being in context in universities with the heritage of the Stone Campbell movement, and you see a different dimension, you see a broader lens. And so that class was all about calling. And I feel like that completely ties into what we're talking about today.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so for our listeners, I want to talk about, I want to lead in to what we're going to talk about today with this term, generational discipleship, being really a serious concern. And the retention of millennials is estimated anywhere from 30 to 50% on average in our fellowship of churches. And so in different movements and different movement, heritage and so forth, that number can be different. But I think for a lot of parents, people feel lost and disoriented on how to connect with where their kids are at developmentally and spiritually. And it's difficult to know what that should look like. I think also teens and parents have a lot of anxiety. I think about with studying the Bible and the pressure, the fear, the panic that some parents feel about when their kids are going to become a Christian and when they're going to get saved and knowing they're going to be in heaven and so forth like that is high. And then for the kids, studying the Bible and going through that process and having all the acceptance that comes with that, I think that has a lot of anxiety with it as well. And what I want to do today is I want to step back and look a little bit at the developmental perspective. And I think that's what you really specialize in, is really looking at this in terms of how things, like there's a process to this. And I think you really speak to the process versus this just being an event. And so you wrote a paper on viewing youth ministry through the lens of, and we're going to talk more about it, but James E. Loder's The Transforming Moment Applied to Resilient Discipleship of Adolescents. That is a mouthful, but you have done incredible research around this. Can you tell us a little bit about your paper and your research?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and if anybody wants that, I can happily share that. So there was a book published by Barna, the publishers, and the authors were Kinnaman and Matlock, and they wrote a book in 2019, Faith for Exiles, 5 Proven Ways to Help a New Generation Follow Jesus and Thrive in Digital Babylon. And that in and of itself, kind of summarizes our culture. We're global, we're digital, we're connected in different ways, how we communicate, etc. And so they came away with doing this research, and that's what I pivoted off of. I kind of, where they ended their research, I customized it for our culture, because every context, location, heritage of Christianity has its own nuances. And so I wanted it to be relevant to our movement, to ICOC. And so building off of those 5 practices that they itemized, I did a literature research on best practices in youth ministry and parenting. And then I also did primary research last summer, and it was, I interviewed 20 youth ministers, and it so happened that they divided into millennials that were raised in the church and are in youth ministry, and then the older youth ministers that have been in practice for 15, 20 years. And so they have more of a longitudinal perspective. And so getting both voices was incredible. And so that's really the foundation of what this research is all about.
Do you mind going through a couple of those practices?
Sure. So the foundation that Kinnaman and Matlock identified in their research was 5 practices. One is to form a resilient identity in Jesus. They need to experience intimacy with Jesus, and that's a tall order for a very young person. But as they age, that this is very, very possible, and we can talk about details if we need to. But moving on to the second practice they identified, it was that how they stated, in a complex and anxious age, develop the muscles of cultural discernment. And kind of interweaving that with the research that I did, I feel like youth ministry and peer relationships and mentoring relationships in community creates that countercultural discernment, so that kids involved in teen ministry, it's not all about fun and games, of course, and definitely the critical piece of feeling belonging, which we'll talk about later, but also a place that is safe and they can talk through the intense cultural things that they're facing that we never faced a generation ago. And then practice 3, when there's isolation and mistrust, there are norms, but to be able to forge meaningful intergenerational relationships, I think that's something that needs to be deliberate, to be honest, in our fellowships, because we tend to be siloed. So say, for example, you have a Bible talk, though, that is intergenerational. That is very healthy because you've got the generations teaching one another, even the young teaching the old, and showing mutual respect. So that was practice 3. Practice 4, to ground and motivate an ambitious generation, train for vocational discipleship. This is an interesting concept. I don't think we quite grasped this one yet. This is just my opinion. Being at Abilene, again, that's a Church of Christ University, they intertwine this idea, and Harding did too, of vocation and ministry intertwined, meaning that even if you're not in the full-time ministry, you are potentially can be in the vocation of ministry, and blending that all together. That's a whole nother topic we could talk about separately.
Sure.
And then the 5th practice, curb entitlement and self-centered tendencies by engaging a countercultural mission. This, I think, we do a beautiful job with, honestly, with Hope and Hope Youth Corps. We give our kids opportunities to serve and to contrast lives and, I'll leave it at that. I felt like that is definitely something that our children benefited from. And I think the entitlement also, though, is something in the household and putting boundaries around indulgences and things like that. But I'll leave that there as well. Did you want me to go on about something else?
So I have a question with the practices here. Is there an order to these in terms of like we layer them, or are they just all simultaneously supposed to happen?
They're definitely interwoven, not necessarily in order. I would say the first thing that's the most critical is the first one, is that we're modeling practice 1 in our own lives, in our families, in our parenting, our individual relationships with God, me as mom and my husband as dad, that there's an intimacy that's that's woven into the fabric of our being and our character. The rest, I think, is honestly in community. And we do that together in terms of our connections to the body and our relationships within the church.
Okay. So a couple things here. I really like, and I think this point maybe goes with 3 a little bit more, but I mean, we're not, every movement has tribe. Like, tribe is not wrong. And especially when we get down to belonging and so forth like that, this is really important. But tribe is not wrong. I think to become overly tribal is a problem. And typically, like you were saying, I think isolation and so forth like that, when we create pockets, we create silos, like you were saying, we can create a little bit of a culture that has these levels or these hierarchies. And then with that, we can become disintegrate. We can become disconnected. And I really like your idea about connecting the generations rather than segmenting them. And later in the interview, we're going to get a little bit more into why that's even more important as we look at ministry models, like having a teen ministry and then putting all this pressure on a teen minister and how that implodes typically. But I love the stages here. 3 really grabs me. This is when isolation and mistrust are the norms, forging meaningful intergenerational relationships. Tell me a little bit more, and we don't have to go too much in it, a little bit more about this mistrust. Isolation and mistrust are the norms, according to what?
That was Kinnaman and Matlack's research. That's the conclusion that they came to between the generations, age-wise. There isn't naturally a forging of respect that you would see typically, like even in the scriptures or in other cultures for that matter. I would say this is an American thing where the mutual respect of your elders or of the children. It could be there could be discrimination in either direction, but what I see, like in an Indian culture, there's an incredible respect to get advice or to, in their family dynamic. So I think there's just naturally, we're programmed as Americans to be more independent and not seek that. I'm not saying that's true about the church. I'm just saying it's a tension that we face in the fabric of our being, living where we live. That's all.
No question. So the next piece comes from What Our Children Have Faith, John Westerhoff. And I really like the way that he breaks this down. I would love for you to share, there's 4 different pieces here about this. Can you share these with us? I think this is very powerful.
Sure. So after I kind of, these things that I've learned that have kind of been in segments, but I took a course from a Dr. Ron Bruner, and Ron Bruner co-edited a book that many of you may be familiar with called Owning Faith. Dave Pachta actually has a chapter in that book. And Ron Bruner was my professor for a course called Engaging Adolescents in Spiritual Formation. And he presented a series of different models of faith formation. And when I had conversation with him, he mentioned that the Westerhoff model was like the one that fit us the most in terms of our heritage. And so so Westerhoff breaks this down as, and this has relevance also because of the delay of adolescence. We now, from adolescence now stretches from 11 or 12 to age 25, which is a much bigger stretch than previous generations. And so what's significant about this is that recognizing that some of these stages might be longer than they were in the past. So I'll preface it with that. So the first stage is behave, which we can all relate to. We want a toddler, we want our young children, elementary school, to obey us for their own good, to protect them. And so that's that is part of human development, but it's also a part of faith formation, because we're modeling God in their lives. We're not God to them, but we are representatives of God in our image. And eventually what they need to transition to is God, away from us. And so behaving is the first, formation step in faith formation. The second is belonging. So belonging in family, making sure that the bonds between dad, especially, there's other research that supports dad actually is the most important bond in terms of faith formation, and then mom. And so that there's minimal exasperation in the household, and an elevation of nurturing intimacy, and that sense of belonging, and then transitioning that to the fellowship, that we introduce our children to families that we're an extended family and they belong to that. And then that translates into youth ministry in high school, and then eventually into campus ministry. So all of that belonging is really a critical piece, because believing, you can't really skip belonging right to belief, because belief can be an intellectual exercise without the emotional connectedness component, or connectedness to God component. So behave, belong, then believe. So then having the capacity, obviously, they're old enough after puberty, and every kid is different, but be able to believe the scriptures and trust the scriptures are the word of God, and make that, young adult type of decision. But then what's interesting is something new for me was this understanding that belief actually can stretch all the way through that long tail of adolescence to 25, that there isn't a concreteness to that belief, because adolescence has been delayed, human development has been delayed. So, 1980, an 18-year-old was fully formed in terms of even their minds, brain. And you could speak to this more than I can, Kyle. I'm not the expert here on that aspect at all. But basically, that belief is not concrete for them until 25, and then they own their faith. They become solid disciples. It doesn't mean that if they profess Jesus as Lord and get baptized that they're not Christians at 14, 15, 16, whenever that happens. It just means that there could still be levels of doubt or temptation that are harder for them to overcome. And that development, that nurturing has to continue. So I think we're back to the stat of why are we losing our kids, is the idea that we have to continue to nurture their faith even after they go to college. And that's a piece that I think none of us have really realized. I didn't realize that, and then some campus ministries don't realize that. And I actually had a and I should have mentioned him earlier. I apologize. I feel like I need to respect. Now I forgot. Oh my goodness. Jacques Janice. He helped me do the primary research. He's a minister, an evangelist in South Africa, in Johannesburg. And so the two of us this was like an aha moment for him, because he was a campus minister. And it's like the kingdom kids coming into campus compared to the kids that were not raised in the church and are first generation Christians becoming Christians in campus ministry. There's a contrast in their characters. And it's almost like the ones that are converted on campus have already kind of had this experimentation process. They know what the world has to offer. They're done with it. While our kids, kingdom kids, come into campus and they haven't experienced all this, drama of the world. And so there isn't the same kind of maybe street smart, I'll call it, or that kind of wisdom. They have biblical wisdom. They see, us striving to live a righteous life. But that contrast, they probably see a lot of it at school, but they haven't necessarily lived that life. And so I think understanding these 4 stages helps us to perhaps diagnose where somebody is at. and what more they might need, as opposed to just study the Bible with them and they will get there.
I so appreciate what you're saying. Let me encapsulate part of what you've shared thus far for our listeners. One is that the developmental arc of children is delayed. Now, typically, we look at that and we set milestones, expectations for milestones, educationally, so academically, emotionally, economically. We set our milestones spiritually as well. But unfortunately, we're not very adaptive in how even the baby boomer generation, the expectations, the developmental arc in the baby boomer generation is different than it is now for the millennials, number one. And the baby boomers have assisted in that. It's not like that just happened.
Right.
But you're saying that the developmental arc goes until when insurance rates drop, which is 25.
Yep.
Okay, that's very fair. Let me add a caveat to that, which, by the way, I appreciate you with the whole expert thing, but I consider you very, very adept here. When trauma is involved, there are even more developmental milestones that are missed. So spiritual formation has to take into consideration some of the life experiences that can actually delay that. So that's if, let's say, there's not a 2003 sort of fracture moment, right? So 2003 changed the developmental arc for this whole thing we're talking about for certain people, certain family systems, certain churches possibly, certain regions. There's a collective memory and experience for a lot of people. And their kids went through it as well. It wasn't just the parents, was it? So the developmental process, we have to re-examine that. The other thing that I love that you're saying is that this issue of experimentation has been pathologized. So, and we're going to get late. This is why I have you on. We're going to get to this here in just a moment. Experimentation is part of the formation. However, that runs counter to a lot of parenting, and that creates a lot of anxiety for a lot of parents. What do you mean experimentation is part of formation? No, it's not. I mean, and it's even though most of the parents listening to this, they had their experimentation phase, but then they have expectations for their kids that are different from what they had for themselves. Okay, that's a whole nother thing. But I just love what you're saying about this idea of belonging, the idea of development, reaching into the mid-20s even, and the idea that experimentation is a part of formation. Wow. Let me read a comment that you make in your paper. In churches of Christ, maturing youth choosing to remain within the church as adult believers must claim their identity as followers of Jesus through baptism. However, baptism isn't the final destination of spiritual growth. Instead, it's a necessary landmark in the ongoing life of transformation. This makes the journey for a child raised in the church more of a process of confession than a process of conversion. Implication is experimentation will naturally happen until stage 4, explaining why adolescents are vulnerable to alternatives for human and faith identity formation. Wow, that's quite a bit that we just said there. But I love this idea that someone who's raised in the church, there's a process of confession more than a process of conversion. Mind blown. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, and I honestly can't take credit for it. That came from Dr. Ron Bruner, who taught the class on engaging spiritual formation. And again, that's kind of why I went to ACU. I went to a university that had professors that have lived in a tradition that we embrace. And they've gone before us, have 7, 8, 9 generations, since the 1800s. And so this is their model. The churches of Christ believe this and practice this and they don't expect a first generation conversion to be like our second generation conversion to be like a first generation conversion. We can relate to that, or confession, because I will call myself a pagan all day long, even though I was raised in a religious household. But my kids were generally raised differently, genuinely raised differently than I was. And so, it is a different conversion experience for them, and it is a confession, and it does, have a trajectory to it until human development and faith formation complete. They have to both complete. And without human development completing, we have to be careful about our expectations, but still toe the line, but gently and with unconditional love and great patience until they own their faith as well.
Okay, let me read something else that you state in your paper. In essence, Langford and Loader connect the need for unconditional love. Let's go back to this belonging piece, because this is, I think, where this really connects. First in the home, in the koinonia of believers, to support the transition of ego identity, fully transition to the lordship of Jesus Christ at baptism. Until the adolescent is fully formed, the approximate age of 25, there is continued vulnerability to an adolescent's faith resiliency. Forms of hypocrisy, fear, control, or abandonment can devastate positive effects and growth until faith and human development are fully formed together in adulthood, leading to maturity and resilient discipleship. Wow. If you could just break that down a little bit and take a couple pieces that really mean a lot to you, what would be a couple pieces in that statement that mean a lot?
So I would say maybe a story might be relevant at this point. In my research, I had the privilege, and God just set this up, orchestrated it, where I ended up in these interviews with youth ministers. There was a mom and dad in youth ministry that have been in youth ministry for 20 years, and then a daughter and son-in-law that I interviewed, like on the tales of one another. And so it was like I was living in two different worlds, a flashback, back to the future, if you will, of the parents talking about how they raised their daughter, and then the daughter, speaking back to her experience. And so what they modeled for me was this safety, this there isn't an unhealthy pressure here. There's an expectation and a desire for their daughter to become a Christian, but they didn't create weird constructs. Did you have your quiet time? Did you do this? Did you do that? No, you're going to church with us. And the pressure, there was an expectation, but there wasn't a pressure, an unhealthy pressure. And she validated that. And what was interesting to me about this family is that there were 3 children, and she was the oldest. And she did not become a Christian and during her teen years. The younger 2 did. She had a different temperament. I think it has a lot to do with understanding our children's temperament. And so the parents had enough wisdom to understand that this is not worth forcing. They just mind-boggling that with their first, they didn't make that big mistake. And I feel like I did as a out of fear, wanted my kids to become Christians as in high school, before they left the house. And so it was interesting to me, the environment, the resilient koinonia. So Kinnaman, bringing back the research, Kinnaman and Matlock talk about resilient discipleship. If we are to expect resilient disciples, we need to have resilient koinonia, meaning resilient fellowship, that the walls are padded. They're not going to get hurt.
I love that.
By us. It's one thing if the world hurts them and we're not perfect. And one of the other things that came out of our research was that a repentant parent, not a perfect parent, is the one that wins their kid over.
Wow.
And there's also theology for that too. It's called kenosis. Kenosis is found in Philippians 2, where Jesus went through self-emptying and having a vulnerability and a trust forming through those bonds, that you, when you blow it with your kid, that you're humble, you're vulnerable, and you're like, I am so sorry I did that. I've had a bad day, whatever it is, but there's a healing that happens relatively quickly, and there's no remnant to develop a bitter root. Because if a bitter root develops with the parent, it could potentially develop with the church and then develop with God. And it's pretty interesting how all of that is so interconnected.
Oh, this is incredible. I'm really glad that we are having this conversation today, because there's a lot of parents out there who I think have realized that making disciples is a bit different from raising disciples. So in other words, taking someone who, to your point, is in college, or someone who's a single, or someone who's married, and they've gone through their life stages, they've gone through all the developmental milestone moments, and making a disciple of someone who's had psychological formation and development is different from raising someone from conception and then bringing them up in your home. Because the people we study the Bible with, typically they don't come home and live with us and become dependents, and we claim them on our tax forms. Like, it's so different than raising. And so and I love what you just said vulnerably, Matina, where you were like, hey, when I did it, when it was my turn to raise a disciple, I'm assuming you and your husband, you guys have made a lot of disciples, but
Yes.
raising a disciple,
Yes.
that was a signature moment. And you learned some things. And then, of course, with this young lady that you had shared, what really feels like the parents did is they gave their child agency, which is the
Yes.
same thing that God gives us. So it's almost as if anxiety is the culprit. We're deeply anxious about something. And what happens is we turn our children into containers for our anxiety, and they feel that. And it does interfere, it sounds like, with their development. And there's an unfairness to that. And then there's a rebellion. And, when people aren't able to advocate, they typically protest. And so
Very true.
my son, who's 2, he's getting really good at protesting because he's sensing his advocacy. And so if I take his ability to advocate, it's going to result in a protest. And I think that happens when kids are 18, 19 years old as well. And it's interesting, the overnight transition, right? Where a kid has to obey rules almost to some degree in high school. Then all of a sudden they're in college and the veil is lifted. Pandora's boxes. I mean, like, whoa, what do we expect them to do? And then if everything is, let me go up to your first point about behaving. If that is where we set the rubric, is in behaving, then possibly we're going to have some big issues with our kids, because the way we look at the Westerhoff model, behaving is just one part. Belonging, believe, become, that's like a process. And so the goalpost is much more than just, are my kids behaving? Let me speak to real quickly. Let me speak to this No, go ahead. What were you going to say?
I was just going to say, I think the glue for the Westerhoff model is the first practice that Kinnaman and Matlock talk about, which is intimacy. First, intimacy with parents, safe intimacy, and then with God eventually. So fostering intimacy along the way is really the glue that holds those 4 things together.
Okay, so last question here. When it comes to your conclusion, you state there is no formula. And again, I just want to recap here. By the time we get to your conclusion in the paper, this is after you've done the interviews, you've done your research about what are the factors that lead to resiliency when it comes to discipleship. And you've interviewed different people. And so this conclusion is at the end of a paper that has investigated what are those resiliency factors. So there is no formula. Sounds like Ecclesiastes. Allow for the mystery of God by faith. There is always hope for the adult children of God, well beyond adolescence. However, with some exceptions, households with authentic, resilient disciple parents may have some children do well spiritually and others do not. On the other hand, families with spiritually single parents, which was mine, or severe marital dysfunction become thriving, resilient disciples. So let me just say for a moment, my mom was a single mom raising 2 kids, my sister and I. And my grandma is the one who actually took us to church. My sister also studied the Bible, almost got baptized. Point is my mom has only come to church a couple times. She doesn't regularly go. But the point is that I became a Christian. And if we're trying to create some sort of Excel spreadsheet, I don't know that will work. And it feels like your paper is saying just that. There is no formula for any parents here. So can you share a little bit about that? Because that creates some anxiety.
It does. And I again, the sample was, here in the US. I'm going to contrast that in a moment with another ministry. But I would say that it really depends on the temperament of the child. We can do everything that we can, possibly know to do. And it's important that we don't guilt ourselves out. I think that's where I'm coming from, I think, in sharing that even. But that statement was made, I would say, out of all the 20 interviews of the youth ministers, I would say probably half of them said that. And it's like I've seen, anecdotally, this side and this side of the coin. And it's like we have to do what we know is right to nurture human development, the bond with parents and children, and obey the scriptures. And it's still ultimately the choice of each of our children what they're going to do with their faith. And that's, could be disheartening to think about. However, on the flip side of all of this, I've started to work with Dr. John Louis, who many of you I'm sure know. He and his wife Karen wrote a book, Good Enough Parenting, and they have in their ministries in Indonesia and in Singapore, in the Asian ministries that they've influenced, they have an 80% retention of those kids that were baptized in the church as teens. And so if you think about his 2 big premises are limit the exasperating experiences, Ephesians 6:4, fathers do not exasperate your children, and increase the nurturing interactions. And their books are incredible, but really we can influence the probability, but ultimately the choice is left up to the individual, to the child themselves when they reach age of accountability.
Which is a whole another theological dilemma, the age of accountability.
Right.
So you spoke to something, and I really want to speak to the emotional dilemma of the parents. As parents, we over-internalize our children's decisions. And whether or not they become baptized disciples, we internalize that as a core flaw. And there's a lot of comparing that happens. Well, what did that parent do over there that I didn't do? And you're mentioning with John Louis, it's interesting that factor of what creates resiliency and retention, really retention, has to do, again, with agency. Whether we give our kids the ability to advocate, we don't exhaust them, we don't exasperate them. And I just think that when it comes to the pressure that parents feel, again, that gets projected out in the children's directions. And so it's almost as if we need to help, and I'm one, parents to deal with their anxiety, their helplessness, their feelings of powerlessness.
Yeah. So there's one thing that we didn't really touch on is this Loader's model. And that, was part of the lens of the research as well, along with Kinnaman and Matlock and Faith of Exiles. But he talks about this dimension. If we enter into kind of this dimension that every child, just like we know with every disciple that, or every non-Christian we meet, they have a void. You know, Ecclesiastes talks about that. And it's really up to us not to persuade. It's up to us to have the faith and to pray and to, you know, be what we need to be for them in terms of the nurturing relationship and the bond. Obviously, there has to be tough talks as well, selectively on what those are. But ultimately, again, it goes back to what you said. It's agency. And so what Loder talks about is they have self to deal with. They have the world that how they perceive the world that they're in. And they have the void that they were also, because we're born into a broken world, and sin is present. And eventually they will become sinners, obvious sinners. And then there has to be even more so room left for God's holiness, God's intervention, God's supernatural power. I think in the 21st century, we've lost that. We've demystified God. And it's really more about our faith, replacing our anxiety with faith. And I don't mean that to be a pat answer, but, you know, literally begging God, fasting. And I'm sure there are parents out there that have done that for years. But I can tell you, even in seeing my own parents, they became Christians at 83 and 92.
Oh, wow.
And your children may become Christians well beyond when you've gone to heaven. And so I do want to leave with this very encouraging note. Within the interviews, again, of those youth ministers that have been doing it for decades, or 12 to 15 years, or 2 decades, what they're saying now that we're in our second, third generation of disciples, because our movement is 40 years old, they're seeing droves of young adults coming back, or people in their 30s, saying, this was home. I left home, meaning the church, meaning this was a place, a sanctuary for me. And now I finally realize it. And so I think it's just a matter, I'm not saying that everybody 100%, you know, Jesus says it's a narrow road, but ultimately not to lose faith, and that on their dying deathbed, it's possible. Anything is possible. And I saw that with my agnostic father. And so the same can be true. And I know there are stories throughout the kingdom like this. And so we're starting to witness that coming back. Michael Burns talked about it in Minneapolis, Matt Fridley in Chicago, and in the ministries that he led on the East Coast. Kids are reaching out, texting them, saying, I want to come back, I want to talk, I want to, you know, the safe relationships, they don't forget them. And so continuing to nurture those relationships in terms of the parents, even with their adult children, that's the best thing you can do, nurturing the belonging again, going back to nurturing the belonging again.
I love that. I so appreciate everything you're sharing. And I think there's scriptures that parents cling to as they are in their emotional desperation. And one of the things I study is how trauma affects our hermeneutic. In other words, you can take a scripture, and you talk about biblical literacy. I think you've been a huge advocate for biblical literacy. But, you know, you look at Proverbs 22:6, train a child in the way they should go. And when they are old, they will not depart from it. The unfortunate translation, or the way we interpret that rather, is this idea that if I do my job, there's going to be this result. Now, here's what your research says, is there is no formula. And that actually does not contradict Proverbs 22:6 at all, because the reality in the Hebrew of what Proverbs 22:6 is saying is, it's more of an admonishment than a promise. It's do your job, stay spiritual, stay godly, be filled with God's Spirit in a New Testament context. And that is your job. That is your assignment. That is the admonition. That is the exhortation. Do your job as a parent. And that scripture is really saying is, don't be surprised when your children continue in the direction that you've trained them. When they are old, they will not depart from it. Train them. But then the thing about training is that the kid needs an opportunity to deploy. The child has to be field tested. And if there's any parent who I think has the most experience points, I think it's God. And I don't think, it's interesting how we reject God. Yet, interestingly enough, he's secure enough to give us free will. And it's almost as if we give our kids free will, they already have it. There's this anxiety about what kids are going to do with it. And newsflash, they already have it. And if we don't treat them as such, they're just going to become deceitful, which is a huge character flaw. We don't want that. So I so appreciate what you're sharing. I think the way that we look at the scriptures, I think the need of the hour, biblical literacy, is really important. To your point, because your research is showing us that, hey, we're desperate as parents. And we're looking for answers. We're looking for solutions. And really what I hear your paper really saying is it's a call to resiliency within the parents. It's almost, is it fair to say as we get ready to close here that children mirror their parents' spiritual resiliency to some degree? In other words, they have to see it modeled.
I do believe that, but I also believe that the mentors in their lives, because, there's a unique relationship with parents, and kids can only get so much from their parents. And I really believe that's why the body is there for us to be in community, so that we can learn from others, because, it's part of, adolescence and puberty to reject what your parents have to say. But if it's corroborated in community with other people that you respect, suddenly it's like, maybe mom and dad are right. And so I think it's a joint resilient koinonia. It's the parents' household and the church's environment and fellowship that helps form that faith together with God, obviously.
I think that's very fair. It takes a village. And unfortunately, that runs counter to our individualistic culture. And so that's part of the burden that the next generation is going to have to bear, is the economy of individualism. I so appreciate your research. I'm gonna try to steal you again. I want you back. I want you to come back. We're gonna dissect another aspect of your research. There are many parents who want to hear more about what your research is found. And so I really look forward to having you back, and I really mean that. And I'm excited about how God is going to use you. You've got incredible research that you're going to be doing, that you've got coming up. You're going to be graduating next year. I just am very excited how you've embraced God's call for your life, Matina.
Thank you, Kyle. It's been an honor and a privilege to talk to you. I respect you so much, and it's been a pleasure, and I would look forward to coming back whenever you'd like. Thank you.
Oh, man. Yes. Well, I say this to all my guests. I'm going to say it to you, and I mean it in a just full heart, is that we are with you, Matina, and God is for you. Bless you.
Thank you, Kyle. God bless you. Take care.
So if you've been listening through the entire video, I just want to thank you so much for our listeners. The other thing is that I appreciate you subscribing, liking, sharing, hitting the bell notification if you're watching on YouTube, if you're on the podcast. I appreciate the views there as well. I hope that you're getting what you need. The channel is growing. The subscribers are increasing literally every day. And my goal is to get to 1,000. I appreciate everyone. Please subscribe. 1,000 is kind of a benchmark in the YouTube world, but we'll get there when we get there. My biggest concern is that people get what they need. And my hope is that you continue to get what you need. Thank you so much for joining, and I will see you next time.